Remember those forgotten barbecue recipes you could only find in old cookbooks? They made backyard cookouts simple, smoky, and full of pride. When did we let flavors like that disappear? Sweet pickle brined barbecue chicken was one of those recipes you would never expect to work, but somehow it always did. Back in the day, no one wasted anything, especially not leftover pickle juice sitting in the jar after all the pickles were gone. That briny, vinegary, slightly sweet liquid was kitchen gold. Southern families, especially in small towns across Georgia and Alabama, would soak their chicken in it before grilling. It tenderized the meat, gave it a salty, sweet tang, and made backyard barbecue night feel a little more special, even if you barely had $2 to your name. The sugar in the brine caramelized as the chicken cooked, leaving those crispy, charred edges we all dream about now. It showed up at church dinners, small-town fairs, and lazy summer evenings when families gathered around smoky grills. It was the kind of meal that stretched what you had and made everyone feel full, proud, and taken care of. Somehow, over the years, that recipe drifted off into the pages of old spiral-bound cookbooks and quietly disappeared from most tables. Funny how the simplest tricks are the first ones to fade away. Molasses glazed ribs with cider vinegar mop were a backyard masterpiece long before barbecue competitions and flashy grills took over. This sticky, sweet rib recipe came straight from Appalachian families who learned to stretch every ounce of flavor they could from simple ingredients. Molasses was cheap, easy to store, and packed with that deep, rich sweetness, while cider vinegar kept the ribs from ever feeling too heavy. Folks would baste the ribs over and over with that glossy mixture, each layer bubbling up in the fire, caramelizing just enough to leave your fingers sticky and your stomach rumbling. Passed down through handwritten recipe boxes, this one had roots going back to colonial days when molasses and vinegar were kitchen staples in every mountain cabin and farmhouse. These ribs were not just food, they were a little victory for families making do with what they had, grilling over hickory wood or lump charcoal when the weather was right. They vanished over time, buried under bottled sauces and shortcuts, but the memory of sweet, smoky molasses ribs lingers for anyone lucky enough to have tasted them by the fire. Mustard slaw, pulled pork sandwiches, were the unsung heroes of church picnics and family reunions down in the Carolinas. The pork itself was slow-smoked, pulled apart, and soaked in that tangy, vinegary sauce the region was famous for, but the real magic came from the mustard slaw piled high on top. Bright yellow, sharp, and crunchy, it cut through the richness of the meat and added just the right kind of bite. You did not need much else. A soft bun, a heap of pulled pork, and that mustard slaw turned a simple sandwich into something unforgettable. It was cheap to make, easy to feed a crowd, and somehow always managed to disappear first from the food table. Old cookbooks from South Carolina to Tennessee carried versions of this recipe, handwritten in the margins or tucked between yellowed pages. Over time, fancier toppings and bottled coleslaws replaced that bright, homemade mustard slaw, and the classic pulled pork sandwich lost a little of its character. Funny how the best flavors often get replaced by convenience. Coca-Cola basted brisket sounds like a dare from a backyard cookout, but in 1970s Texas, it was the secret behind some of the most tender, caramelized brisket you could find. Soda was cheap, sweet, and readily available. So it did not take long for clever home cooks to pour it over their meat and let the sugar do the heavy lifting. As the brisket smoked low and slow, the Coca-Cola worked its magic, tenderizing the tough cut and forming a sticky, flavorful crust that locked in the juices. It was a little weird, sure, but it worked, and it worked well. Families across Texas would proudly serve this brisket at cookouts, community picnics, and backyard get-togethers where everyone brought a dish and hoped to impress. It disappeared when bottled sauces and pre-marinated meat took over grocery shelves, and homemade tricks like this faded into old recipe boxes. But for those who remember, Coca-Cola brisket was a little slice of smoky, sweet Texas pride. Green tomato relish for barbecue sausages was the kind of backyard side dish you only found if you were lucky enough to have a neighbor with a good garden and an old cookbook. Those tangy, underripe tomatoes were chopped, tossed with onions, peppers, vinegar, and a little sugar, then simmered down into a chunky, bright relish. It was the perfect topping for grilled sausages, adding sharpness and a bit of sweetness to cut through the fatty meat. Every summer, families would can jars of the stuff, filling their shelves with row after row of bright green preserves. It was a backyard barbecue essential in small towns, where people made their own sauces, sides, and toppings from whatever they grew. Over time, garden relish disappeared from most tables, replaced by bottled condiments and grocery store shortcuts. But for those who knew, there was nothing quite like biting into a smoky sausage with that crisp, tangy relish on top. It was homemade pride in every spoonful. Peanut butter barbecue sauce for chicken legs was one of those Depression-era inventions that sounded strange, but made perfect sense when you tasted it. Down in Georgia, families struggling to stretch their meals turned to pantry staples to make the most of what little they had. Peanut butter was cheap, filling, and packed with flavor, so it ended up in everything, even barbecue sauce. Mixed with vinegar, sugar, and spices, it coated grilled chicken legs with a rich, nutty glaze that somehow worked like magic. The sauce caramelized over the fire, leaving those legs sticky, smoky, and unforgettable. Folks might have raised an eyebrow the first time they heard about it, but after one bite, they were hooked. It became a quiet staple in small towns and farm cookouts, disappearing only when bottled sauces and new recipes pushed the old tricks aside. But for those who remember the smoky sweetness of peanut butter barbecue, it never really left. Barbecue. Bean pie with bacon lattice was one of those comfort meals that belonged more on a picnic table than in a cookbook, but somehow it found its way into both. Picture this: a deep dish packed with baked beans, smoky barbecue sauce, and a golden crust woven from crispy bacon strips. Sweet, savory, and filling enough to stretch one meal into two, it was a dish you could always count on to satisfy a crowd. Families in the South, especially in places like Mississippi and Louisiana, baked these pies for backyard cookouts, Sunday dinners, and community potlucks. The old cookbooks carried the recipe in neat, handwritten script, passed down like a little secret of how to make beans feel fancy. Over time, it quietly vanished, forgotten in favor of faster, simpler meals. But those who remember the bubbling, smoky bean pies fresh from the oven still swear there is nothing quite like it. Grilled bologna steaks with onions and barbecue rub were the forgotten workhorse of Midwest lodge cookouts and neighborhood barbecues. You took thick slices of bologna, not the thin sandwich kind, but hefty pan-sized rounds, dusted them with a smoky rub, and tossed them on the grill. The edges curled, the fat sizzled, and the whole backyard smelled like summer. Onions went right on the grill too, caramelizing in the heat and adding a little sweetness to every bite. It was a blue-collar classic, perfect for fraternal lodge gatherings, fire hall cookouts, or just feeding a crowd on the cheap. Bologna was affordable, filling, and packed with nostalgia for anyone who grew up with it. Over time, the trend of grilling it disappeared, replaced by fancier meats and new backyard favorites. But the memory of smoky, crispy bologna steaks lingers for those who remember standing by the grill, waiting for their slice. Apple cider and brown sugar pork chops were a taste of Appalachian mountain cooking that somehow slipped away over the years. Thick, bone-in pork chops marinated in tangy cider and dark brown sugar until the meat soaked up every bit of sweet, sour goodness. Then they hit the grill, sizzling and caramelizing at the edges, filling the air with that unmistakable smoky, sugary scent. Families in the Ozarks and Appalachians used this recipe as a way to turn simple pork into something worth gathering around for. The cider kept the meat juicy, the sugar crisped up the edges, and every bite tasted like home. You would find it in old regional cookbooks, tucked between pages stained with grease and thyme. But like so many recipes from those days, it faded away, replaced by bottled marinades and store-bought flavor. Funny how the best meals sometimes vanish without anyone noticing. Charcoal-cooked, foil-wrapped cabbage with vinegar drizzle was one of those side dishes you forgot about until you saw it tucked into the coals at a family barbecue. It was simple. Wedge some cabbage, wrap it tight in foil with butter and a splash of vinegar, and let the heat work its magic. The cabbage softened, the edges crisped, and the whole thing soaked up smoky flavor from the fire. It was cheap, easy, and surprisingly satisfying, the kind of meal that showed up when the garden was full and money was tight. In the 1960s, this was a quiet staple at cookouts across the South and Midwest, pulled steaming from the coals and served alongside grilled meat. Over time, people moved on to fancier sides, and foil-wrapped cabbage vanished from backyard grills. But for those who remember peeling back the foil and smelling that tangy, smoky cabbage, it is a flavor you never quite forget. Tangy Apricot BBQ. Drumsticks were one of those sticky sweet recipes that showed up everywhere in the 1970s, straight out of those old community cookbooks with hand-drawn covers and faded pages. It was simple, but it worked, and families loved it because you could stretch it to feed a crowd without spending much. Apricot preserves were the star, a jar of that golden sugary spread mixed with mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and a little vinegar to cut through the sweetness. You would baste the drumsticks over the fire, letting the glaze bubble up, caramelize, and coat the skin until it crisped at the edges. The balance of sweet, tangy, and smoky made every bite count, even if the meat was cheap and the sides were basic. It was a backyard cookout staple in small towns from Texas to Kentucky, tucked between potato salads, deviled eggs, and slices of watermelon. Over time, bottled sauces and store-bought shortcuts pushed recipes like this to the back of the drawer, but those who remember know nothing beats the homemade glaze shining on a hot grill under the summer sun. Ketchup and onion-slathered meat patties were not burgers the way we know them now, but they sure did the trick when money was tight and grills were fired up for a weekend cookout. These flat, hand-shaped beef patties were cooked over open flames, basted with sweet ketchup, and covered in softened, grilled onions until they practically melted into the meat. It was a rough-around-the-edges backyard meal, the kind of thing you threw together for summer campfires, family lake trips, or park cookouts with fold-out chairs and coolers of soda. You would flip the patties, brush them with ketchup again, let the onions steam under the grill lid, and suddenly dinner felt like something special. No one cared if the meat was lean or the bread was plain. It was about gathering, sharing, and filling plates with something hot, smoky, and comforting. These days, most folks have swapped simple patties for gourmet burgers stacked a foot high. But the memory of ketchup-slathered meat on a paper plate under string lights still hits home for anyone who grew up with it. Horseradish barbecue. Glazed hot links were bold, smoky, and just spicy enough to remind you that vintage Midwestern barbecue had a little bite to it. Thick sausage links sizzled on the grill, splitting open as they cooked, while the horseradish-laced glaze bubbled over the top and caramelized at the edges. It was sharp, tangy, and full of heat, the kind of backyard staple you would find at lodge cookouts, county fairs, and long, rowdy family barbecues. You did not need fancy sides or complicated sauces. These hot links were a meal on their own, served on soft buns or paper plates with a smear of mustard and maybe some chips on the side. Old cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s carried this recipe, scribbled in margins or tucked between clippings, a reminder of how folks stretched flavor with pantry ingredients and a good fire. Over time, bolder barbecue sauces and milder sausages pushed this spicy classic out of the spotlight. But those who remember know nothing clears your sinuses like hot links glazed with horseradish and smoke. Fire pit potatoes with dill and celery salt were the quiet heroes of backyard barbecues, wrapped in foil, tossed into the coals, and forgotten about until the rest of dinner was ready. You would slice up cheap potatoes, toss them with butter, sprinkle pantry spices like dill and celery salt, then wrap them tight and let the fire do its work. The potatoes came out smoky, soft in the center, with crispy edges and that sharp, herby bite from the seasoning. It was a side dish straight from old church cookbooks across the South, simple, cheap, and guaranteed to fill bellies when meat was scarce and appetites were big. Families brought these to lake days, cookouts, and small-town picnics, sharing foil packets around the fire like treasures pulled from the ashes. Over the years, as pre-made sides and store-bought salads took over, this backyard classic slipped away. But for anyone who remembers peeling open that hot foil and seeing those steaming buttery potatoes, it was a flavor that felt like home. Ginger and soy barbecue ribs were one of the earliest international twists to hit backyard grills, showing up in 1980s cookbooks when home cooks started experimenting with Asian-inspired flavors. These ribs were marinated in soy sauce, ginger, brown sugar, and garlic, then slow-cooked over open flames until sticky, smoky, and packed with sweet, savory punch. It was different from the heavy tomato-based sauces people were used to, but the flavor caught on fast. You would find these ribs at cookouts, block parties, and backyard potlucks where adventurous neighbors wanted to show off something new. The soy glazed the meat, the ginger cut through the fat, and the whole thing crackled on the grill, filling the air with a scent that turned heads. It felt a little daring, a little fancy, but it was still cheap enough for everyday folks to throw together. Over time, flashier sauces and trendy fusion recipes buried this old-school favorite. But the memory of ginger soy ribs on a summer grill still lingers for those who remember the first time they gave it a try. Barbecue spaghetti from Memphis was a little weird, a little wonderful, and 100% proof that leftover pulled pork never went to waste in southern kitchens. It started with a simple, meaty tomato sauce spiked with smoky barbecue flavors, then tangled up with hot spaghetti noodles and served right alongside ribs, chicken, and corn on the cob at family cookouts. The first time you heard about it, you might have raised an eyebrow, but one bite and you were hooked. The sauce was rich, tangy, and packed with slow-cooked pork that clung to every strand of pasta. It showed up at reunion cookouts, church dinners, and potluck tables, a quirky but beloved Memphis tradition tucked into old community cookbooks. It made perfect sense. You had leftover meat, extra sauce, and hungry mouths to feed. Over time, pasta purists and barbecue snobs might have scoffed, but those who grew up with a plate of smoky spaghetti beside their ribs know it was one of the best things to come off a backyard grill. Crispy barbecue. Corn fritters were the golden, crackling side dish that turned up on cookout tables right when you needed something hot, salty, and fried to go with smoky meat. The batter was simple. Creamed corn, cornmeal, maybe a handful of flour, and little bits of bacon or leftover barbecue chopped right in. You would spoon it into hot oil, let the edges crisp up, and suddenly the whole backyard smelled like summer. They were sweet, smoky, and just greasy enough to feel indulgent, even when money was tight. These fritters showed up in small-town cookouts, church potlucks, and family barbecues, tucked beside ribs, pulled pork, and plates of baked beans. You could stretch a batch to feed a crowd, and nobody ever left hungry when the fritters hit the table. Over time, as diets changed and store-bought sides replaced homemade staples, this crispy classic drifted off into forgotten pages of old cookbooks. But for those who remember biting into a hot corn fritter with smoky barbecue tucked inside, it is a taste that never really leaves you. Buttermilk marinated barbecue chicken quarters were the quiet staple of Deep South cookouts, soaking overnight in tangy buttermilk until the meat turned tender, juicy, and ready to hit the grill. The buttermilk kept the chicken moist, while a smoky, peppery rub crisped up the skin over low, slow flames. It was simple, affordable, and always hit the spot, especially when served with cornbread, potato salad, and sweet tea on a hot summer day. Families in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi tucked this recipe into old spiral-bound cookbooks, passed down through generations with little tweaks and tricks. It was not fancy, but it was reliable. The kind of meal you could count on to bring people together when the grill was fired up and the picnic tables were full. Over the years, bottled marinades and quicker methods replaced this slow, thoughtful tradition. But those who remember pulling smoky, buttermilk brined chicken off the fire know some flavors are worth holding on to. Grilled cornbread with honey butter glaze was the kind of side dish that turned heads at old barbecue contests, served hot off the grill with edges crisp enough to crack and a smear of melted honey butter dripping down the sides. You would bake the cornbread first, slice it thick, then toss it on the grates to char just enough for that smoky, caramelized bite. The honey butter glaze was simple. Soft butter, a drizzle of honey, maybe a pinch of salt. And it transformed basic cornbread into something special. It showed up at county fairs, small-town cook-offs, and family reunions where everyone brought their best dishes to the table. People loved it because it was cheap, easy, and felt a little indulgent in the middle of a humble cookout. Over time, fancier bread and store-bought rolls took its place, and this backyard classic quietly slipped away. But those who remember crisp, smoky cornbread with honey butter know it stole the spotlight every time. Smoked bologna salad sandwiches were the unexpected star of cold potluck tables, where leftover bologna slices met backyard smoke and got a second life mixed with mayo, relish, and a little crunch. It was cheap, easy, and packed with that unmistakable smoky flavor that only came from a real barbecue pit. Families would slice thick rounds of bologna, toss them on the grill until they bubbled and charred, then chop them up into a creamy, tangy salad spread that filled soft white bread or crackers. It showed up at church picnics, family reunions, and small-town potlucks, always disappearing faster than anyone expected. Old cookbooks carried the recipe in scribbled margins, a quiet reminder that nothing went to waste when times were tight and grills were hot. Over the years, deli meats and pre-made salads replaced homemade bologna spreads, but those who remember smoky, creamy bologna salad sandwiches know it was comfort food at its best, straight from the fire to the picnic table. Beer can turkey with dry herb rub was one of those forgotten backyard stunts that people loved showing off at summer holiday cookouts, long before chicken stole the spotlight. Back in the 1980s, when every neighborhood had a block party and grills were running hot all season, some families upped the ante by sticking a beer can inside a full-size turkey and letting it roast over an open flame. The beer steamed the inside, the dry herb rub crisped the outside, and suddenly the bird came off the grill smoky, juicy, and packed with flavor. It was big, dramatic, and perfect for feeding a crowd when you wanted more than burgers or sausages. Old cookbooks passed this one around like a party trick, a reminder that barbecue could be simple, fun, and bold without spending much. These days, chicken gets all the attention at barbecues, and full-size turkey cookouts have quietly drifted off into old recipe boxes. But those who remember carving into a smoky, beer-steamed turkey right off the grill know it turned every summer cookout into a little celebration. Molasses and mustard-baked onions were a quiet little side dish that filled out barbecue plates in the best way, slow-cooked in foil, tucked near the coals, and forgotten about until everything else was ready. You would slice big yellow onions, drizzle them with dark molasses and tangy mustard, wrap them tight in foil, and nestle them down by the fire to soften and sweeten as the grill worked its magic. The molasses bubbled up, the mustard cut through the richness, and those onions turned meltingly soft with just enough bite left to remind you they were homegrown. They came out piping hot, smoky, and perfect next to a rack of ribs, some charred chicken, or a pile of pulled pork. This was the kind of side dish that families learned to love when money was tight and flavor needed stretching. Over time, as store-bought sides and quick salads took over, little gems like molasses and mustard onions slipped away. But those who remember peeling back that foil and smelling the sweet, smoky onions know it was backyard comfort food at its best. Hickory smoked pork shoulder with tomato vinegar mop sauce was once the crown jewel of old Virginia barbecues, long before bottled sauces made everything feel rushed. You would smoke a pork shoulder low and slow over hickory wood, basting it every hour with a tangy tomato and vinegar mop sauce that kept the meat juicy and packed with smoky, sharp flavor. The mop sauce was thin, bright red, and heavy on the vinegar, cutting through the richness of the pork as it smoked for hours. Families would gather in backyards or community fields, tending the fire, swapping stories, and waiting for that roast to fall apart at the bone. The sauce recipe was passed down through generations, scrawled in cookbooks, and whispered at family gatherings. Over time, big-name brands and grocery store shortcuts replaced homemade mop sauces, and the tradition faded quietly from most backyard grills. Campfire cabbage rolls with barbecue rice filling were the kind of backyard meal you never saw in restaurants but always found at small-town cookouts or camping trips. You would boil cabbage leaves until tender, stuff them with rice, beans, a spoonful of barbecue sauce, and sometimes a little leftover pulled pork if you were lucky. Then they got wrapped in foil, tossed right into the pit oven or buried under hot coals, and forgotten about while the rest of dinner cooked. The rice soaked up the smoky flavor, the cabbage crisped around the edges, and every bite was smoky, soft, and packed with comfort. It was cheap, easy, and fed a crowd without much effort, especially when meat was scarce and sides had to work overtime. You would find this recipe in old fundraiser cookbooks and handwritten family recipe boxes, tucked between casseroles and community potluck favorites. Over time, fancier sides and quicker meals replaced humble dishes like this. Grilled peaches with spiced barbecue rub were the sweet finish to a summer meal, pulled straight from the old Texas barbecue books where dessert always had a smoky twist. You would halve ripe peaches, sprinkle them with leftover spice rub from the ribs or brisket, and toss them face down on the grill until the sugars bubbled and caramelized. The rub added a warm, savory heat that mixed with the fruit's sweetness, turning a plain peach into something bold and unforgettable. This was not the kind of fancy dessert you find in restaurants. It was backyard simplicity at its finest. You would plate them up with a dollop of cream, maybe drizzle some honey over the top, and call it done. Families in Texas, Oklahoma, and the South kept this recipe alive through church cookbooks, neighborhood gatherings, and small-town competitions. But like so many old tricks, grilled peaches drifted off as grocery store desserts and flashy sweets took over. Old-fashioned barbecue chicken spaghetti pie was one of those quirky fundraiser cookbook gems from the 1970s, turning leftover chicken, spaghetti, and barbecue sauce into a baked, cheesy casserole that stretched meals and filled bellies. You would toss cooked spaghetti with shredded barbecue chicken, layer it into a pie dish with sauce, cheese, and sometimes a crunchy breadcrumb topping, then bake it until bubbly and golden. It was smoky, saucy, and surprisingly satisfying, a meal that pulled double duty when you needed to use up leftovers but still feed a crowd. Families brought this dish to potlucks, church picnics, and bake sales, sharing slices that mixed Southern barbecue with Italian comfort food in the best possible way. It was affordable, easy, and always disappeared fast when it hit the table. Over the years, trendier meals and new barbecue fusions took over, leaving old favorites like spaghetti pie behind. But those who remember the bubbling, cheesy casserole pulling out of the oven know it was comfort food done right, with smoky, familiar flavors baked into every bite. Coffee and brown sugar barbecue marinade was a smoky, bold rub that came straight out of oil-stained mechanics shop cookbooks, passed between workers who wanted dinner to hit just as hard as the job. You would mix instant coffee, brown sugar, and spices, rubbing it deep into beef or pork before tossing it on the grill. The coffee added depth and char, the sugar caramelized over the fire, and suddenly your backyard meal had that rich, smoky crust you could never get from bottled sauces alone. It was gritty, simple, and packed with flavor, the kind of trick you picked up from coworkers or family who knew how to make the most of cheap cuts of meat. You would find the recipe scribbled in cookbooks that smelled like grease and charcoal, tucked between casserole pages and quick-fix dinners. Over time, flashier rubs and pre-mixed marinades pushed this old-school method aside. But those who remember the smell of coffee and sugar crisping over hot coals know it was tough, smoky cooking at its best. Grilled macaroni and cheese loaf slices were one of those strange but genius sides you only found at potlucks or regional barbecue competitions when leftover macaroni and cheese needed a second act. You would bake a firm, cheesy macaroni loaf, slice it thick, and toss the pieces right on the grill until the edges crisped. The cheese bubbled, and the smoky flavor worked its way inside. It was rich, salty, and filled every plate with that golden, crispy satisfaction only grilled cheese can bring. Folks from Texas to Tennessee brought these cheesy slabs to cookouts and church events, using up leftovers and turning a simple side into something bold. You would find the recipe tucked inside old potluck guides, faded and food-stained from years of backyard use. Over time, as boxed mac and cheese replaced homemade and quick sides took over, grilled macaroni loaf faded off the grill. But those who remember biting into a hot, smoky slice know it was pure backyard comfort, one crispy, cheesy bite at a time. Barbecue stuffed bell peppers with cracker topping were the old-school way of stretching pulled pork and pantry staples into a hearty, smoky side that doubled as dinner. You would hollow out bell peppers, fill them with pulled pork, breadcrumbs, and maybe a spoonful of leftover barbecue sauce, then crown the whole thing with crushed crackers for a crispy finish. They baked right on the grill or tucked into a campfire pit, soaking up smoky flavor and turning soft and savory by the time the meat was ready. It was the kind of dish that showed up at family cookouts, potlucks, and fire hall fundraisers. A little reminder that simple food could still be special. You would find the recipe tucked into church cookbooks or handwritten recipe boxes, scrawled between notes about casseroles and cornbread. Over time, quicker sides and fancier appetizers took over, but those who remember pulling smoky, cracker-topped peppers off the grill know they were hearty, humble, and packed with barbecue flavor. Cold barbecue chicken pasta salad with sweet pickles was a strange little side that showed up in the 1980s summer supper handbooks, mixing smoky barbecue chicken with chilled pasta, chopped pickles, and a tangy, creamy dressing. It was cold, sweet, savory, and somehow hit every craving all at once. The smoky meat, the sharp pickle brine, the soft noodles, and the cool dressing pulled it all together. Families loved it because it stretched leftovers, filled a crowd, and stayed cool on hot summer days when nobody wanted to fire up the stove. You would find it tucked between watermelon slices, deviled eggs, and plates of ribs at cookouts, family reunions, and potluck tables across the South. It was quirky, cheap, and always disappeared fast when plates were passed around. Over time, the recipe faded behind pre-made salads and store-bought sides, but those who remember scooping chilled barbecue pasta next to their grilled chicken know it was one of the best ways to cool off after a long, smoky afternoon by the fire. We're crossing borders for this next one. Barbecued cowhead, or cabeza, was once a popular dish in Mexican-American communities. So, what makes cabeza such a special treat? Think of an entire cowhead, seasoned with a blend of spices, slow cooked over an open flame until the meat is fall off the bone tender. Sounds amazing, right? Now, I know some of you are squirming at the thought, but hey, food is all about trying new things. The preparation of cabeza is often a communal effort, with family and friends coming together to assist in the cleaning, seasoning, and cooking process. This collaborative spirit adds to the enjoyment of the final meal. The tradition of cooking an entire cowhead dates back to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. They utilized every part of the animal in their cooking, turning what might be considered unconventional cuts into delicious and prized dishes. Applesauce and cottage cheese bowls were one of those sweet, simple meals that came together in minutes, filling the gap between breakfast, lunch, or even dessert when there was not much to spare in the pantry. You would scoop a generous helping of cottage cheese into a bowl, spoon cool applesauce over the top, and maybe add a little cinnamon if you had some lying around. That was all there was to it. It sounds plain now, but back when groceries were scarce and money had to stretch, this quick little bowl was a lifesaver. It was light, cool, sweet, and packed with enough protein to hold you over during busy days. In the 1960s, families leaned on easy meals like this to keep things running, especially when both time and ingredients were in short supply. You would find this simple recipe scribbled in old cookbooks, shared between neighbors, or tucked into handwritten kitchen notes passed down through the years. Some folks dressed it up with fruit or nuts if they had them, but most kept it practical and affordable. It might be forgotten today, but applesauce and cottage cheese bowls kept plenty of households fed, happy, and full with little more than 2 everyday staples. Cinnamon toast with broiler crisp was one of those forgotten 10-minute breakfasts that once felt fancy, even though it came straight from the bread box. You would take a slice of white bread, butter it generously, sprinkle it with sugar and cinnamon, and slide it under the broiler until the top bubbled and crisped. That was it. No pancake mix, no waffle irons, just the broiler and a little patience. Kids loved it because it felt like dessert. Parents loved it because it was fast, and everyone loved it because it used pantry staples. During the Great Depression and even into the 70s, families relied on simple breakfasts like this to stretch groceries without giving up flavor. The sugar caramelized on top, the bread toasted just enough, and suddenly plain breakfast felt like a treat. You could find versions of it in old community cookbooks, school recipe cards, even homemaker magazines. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of frozen waffles and cereal boxes. Fried canned spaghetti and cheese was the dinner you threw together when there was not much left in the fridge and your stomach was growling. You would open up a can of leftover spaghetti, sauce and all, and toss it straight into a hot skillet. As it fried, the sauce thickened, the noodles crisped up around the edges, and everything smelled just good enough to pass for a proper meal. Then you sprinkled shredded cheese over the top, let it melt, and scraped it onto a plate. That was dinner. It came from old cookbooks full of clever ways to stretch leftovers and make canned food feel less like survival and more like comfort. It was salty, cheesy, crispy in the right places, and ready in under 10 minutes. Most folks ate it standing by the stove or while leaning over the kitchen table because that is how those quick meals always went. It was simple, but it filled you up. Funny how a can of spaghetti and some cheese could turn into something worth remembering. So sweetbreads might sound like a dessert, but they're actually a type of offal from the thymus or pancreas of the pig. Traditionally, they were braised or sautéed, but some adventurous souls decided to barbecue them. While they're not for everyone, there's no denying their culinary potential. They have a notable place in Texas barbecue culture. In the Lone Star State, barbecued sweetbreads are considered a delicacy and often featured at high-end barbecue joints and gourmet barbecue competitions. They're typically paired with robust, tangy barbecue sauces and served alongside classic sides like coleslaw or pickles. They weren't the healthiest barbecue choice out there, but their taste made them irresistible. Fried bologna and mustard sandwich was a 10-minute fix that never pretended to be fancy, but always hit the spot. You tossed a slice of bologna into a hot pan, let it sizzle until the edges curled, slapped it onto soft bread, and added mustard. That was it. Simple, quick, and surprisingly satisfying. Back in Grandma's day, this showed up when money was tight, groceries were low, or you just needed something fast before heading back to work or school. It was salty, smoky, and the bologna crisped up just enough to feel like real cooking. Kids loved it. Adults leaned on it, and every household had their own little spin on the recipe. Some added cheese, some toasted the bread, but most kept it plain and practical. You would not find this in glossy magazines, but you would find it tucked in those old handwritten cookbooks, passed down from one generation to the next. Another quick forgotten gem from a time when meals had to be fast, filling, and affordable. Cinnamon sugar butter toast was the kind of simple comfort food that could brighten up an afternoon in under 10 minutes, especially when there was not much else to work with. You toasted up some bread, slathered it with butter, sprinkled on cinnamon and sugar, and called it a snack. That was it. Quick, sweet, and surprisingly satisfying when groceries were scarce and everyone needed a little pick-me-up. It sounds simple, but back then, families leaned on recipes like this to stretch ingredients and turn basic pantry staples into something that felt like a treat. The butter gave it richness, the cinnamon sugar added sweetness, and the toast made it crunchy enough to feel special. You would find this little recipe scribbled onto old note cards, tucked into community cookbooks, or passed down through generations as a fast, affordable way to keep kids happy and tummies full. It might be forgotten today, but for plenty of homes back then, cinnamon sugar butter toast was the perfect fix for long afternoons and short grocery lists. Peanut butter and banana on toast was not just a breakfast. It was a survival trick hidden in government pamphlets and school lunch guides from decades past. You toasted a slice of bread, slathered on peanut butter, and sliced up a banana right on top. It sounds basic now, but during hard times, this was protein, potassium, and energy in one affordable package. Families loved it because it was cheap, quick, and used things every pantry had on hand. The United States Department of Agriculture even recommended it for busy families when money was tight but mornings were busier. Sometimes folks sprinkled sugar or honey over it. Other times they kept it plain. Either way, it filled your belly fast and kept you going. It never made the glossy magazine spreads, but it was reliable, frugal, and good enough to get a generation out the door. These days, breakfasts come frozen or boxed, But back then, a piece of toast and a banana could carry you through the morning. Pimento cheese sandwich melts were one of those quick, bold dinners that came straight from old cookbooks packed with practical, no-nonsense recipes. You took slices of bread, spread them thick with creamy, tangy pimento cheese, and grilled them in a skillet until the outside was golden and crisp. It was not just a sandwich. It was a fast, hot meal with big flavor that came together in 10 minutes or less. Pimento cheese was everywhere back then, especially in southern kitchens, but families all over used it to stretch groceries and add some punch to an otherwise plain dinner. You could eat the melt with pickles on the side or a handful of chips if you had them, but most folks kept it simple. The creamy cheese, the sharp bite of pimentos, the crunchy bread, it all worked together to make a dinner that felt filling without taking much effort. These meals showed up again and again in faded cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards because they did exactly what they needed to: feed everyone fast. Funny how the boldest flavors came from the simplest tricks. Pig ear sandwiches are a unique barbecue treat that once made quite an impression at family gatherings and community events. But they shine best at street foods. In the Philippines, for instance, pig ear sandwiches, known locally as isaw, are a popular snack. In some Latin American countries, particularly in Mexico, pig ears are enjoyed in tacos and tortas. Pig ear sandwiches have been a staple in certain cultures for centuries. In times of scarcity, people learned to utilize every part of an animal to avoid waste. The ears, often overlooked, were discovered to be surprisingly delicious when cooked low and slow. Traditionally, pig ears were boiled or braised until tender, then sliced thin and served on bread with a variety of condiments. Some people preferred them plain, while others enjoyed them with mustard, hot sauce, or barbecue sauce. Creamed corn and hot dog skillet might raise a few eyebrows today, but back then it was pure practicality in a pan. You sliced up hot dogs, tossed them in a skillet, and poured in a can of creamed corn. It bubbled and thickened in minutes, turning into this sweet, salty, creamy meal that filled everyone up fast. You would not find it in fancy cookbooks or glossy magazines, but you would definitely see it scribbled onto a recipe card tucked in Grandma's kitchen drawer. It made use of cheap pantry staples, stretched meat farther, and showed up on busy nights when nobody wanted to cook. Kids loved the weird sweetness, parents loved how far a can of corn could go, and it all came together in under 10 minutes. It sounds strange now, but for families watching every penny, it was comfort food that made do with what little they had. Another forgotten quick fix that quietly slipped off dinner tables over time. Cheddar grits with butter were the Southern kitchen's answer to rushed mornings when everyone still needed something hot and filling. Quick grits, a little butter, a handful of shredded cheese, and breakfast was done before you even finished your first cup of coffee. It was the kind of meal found in tattered cookbooks, handed down from grandmothers who knew how to stretch a pantry without cutting corners on comfort. These grits were creamy, cheesy, and surprisingly satisfying for something that took less than 10 minutes to whip up. You did not need fancy groceries or a stocked fridge, just the basics. It kept bellies full through school days, work shifts, or long hours in the fields. For a lot of folks, this was breakfast you ate standing up, spoon in hand, on your way out the door. Simple, cheap, and quietly comforting. Grits have stuck around in fancier forms, but this quick, everyday version has slipped through the cracks of modern cooking. Corned beef hash from the can was one of those pantry miracles that turned a tin of meat and potatoes into a hot, filling dinner without much fuss. You sliced open the can, dumped the hash into a hot skillet, and let it crisp up around the edges until it was golden and ready to eat. You could fry an egg on top if you had one, but even plain, it did the job. This meal came straight from those old cookbooks that knew exactly how to stretch groceries and fill a plate fast. Corned beef hash was salty, hearty, and packed enough flavor to make up for how simple it was. It fed families during tight times, filled lunchboxes, and showed up on the table when there was not much else to work with. It might not have been fancy, but it was practical. And back then, practical meals were king. These dinners got everyone fed in under 10 minutes, with nothing wasted and no one left hungry. Funny how even canned food like this turned into something that stuck around in people's memories. We're going full-on adventurous eaters now. Barbecued frog legs. Frog legs might seem like an exotic choice for barbecue, but they were once a popular item in some regions. These were the stars of every dinner party in Louisiana. The Louisianians loved seasoning them with Cajun spices, and they were a popular choice at local festivals and seafood boils. The Fellsmere Frog Leg Festival in Florida celebrates the dish every January. They are also eaten in eastern states, but not as commonly. Frog legs are rich in protein, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin A, and potassium. They are often said to taste like chicken because of their mild flavor, with a texture most similar to chicken wings, so they don't taste like whatever you had in mind. Mashed banana and mayo sandwiches might sound strange to modern ears, but back in the day, this sweet and tangy sandwich was a Southern staple that showed up in plenty of lunchboxes. You mashed up a ripe banana, spread it on soft sandwich bread, and added a swipe of mayonnaise. That was it. It was quick, cheap, and surprisingly filling. Families leaned on recipes like this when groceries were scarce and meals had to stretch. The banana added sweetness, the mayo gave it creaminess, and together they turned plain bread into a fast, satisfying lunch. You would find this sandwich scribbled in old community cookbooks, passed down at church picnics, or tucked into handwritten recipe boxes that lived in kitchen drawers. It might be forgotten now, but for plenty of folks growing up during hard times, this odd little sandwich was a reliable 10-minute fix when money was tight and hunger was knocking. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was about as classic as breakfast could get. Quick oats simmered on the stove, topped with a spoonful of brown sugar and a splash of canned milk. It was ready in 10 minutes flat, cheap to make, and warm enough to shake off the worst winter mornings. Families across America leaned on this breakfast when budgets were tight, but everyone still needed something filling to start the day. Quick oats cooked faster than traditional oats, brown sugar gave just enough sweetness, and canned milk made the whole thing creamy even if fresh milk was hard to come by. It showed up in school lunch guides, frugal homemaker magazines, and those old cookbooks buried at the back of every kitchen drawer. For a lot of folks, this was not a special occasion breakfast. It was the daily routine, quiet, dependable, and gone in under 10 minutes. Funny how something so ordinary could disappear so completely, replaced by instant packets and flashy coffee shop menus. Mayo and peanut butter sandwiches with lettuce were one of those strange little meals that somehow showed up again and again in old cookbooks, no matter how odd they sounded. You spread peanut butter on one slice of soft white bread, mayonnaise on the other, tucked in a crisp piece of iceberg lettuce, and slapped the whole thing together. That was dinner. It sounds like a dare now, but back then it was quick, filling, and surprisingly popular when groceries ran low and people had to make the best of whatever was in the pantry. The peanut butter gave it richness, the mayo added tang, and the lettuce brought crunch to pull it all together. It was salty, creamy, a little sweet, and ready in under 5 minutes. Families leaned on meals like this because they stretched simple ingredients, filled you up, and kept dinner from feeling impossible when paychecks were short. It might not have been fancy, but it worked. And funny enough, folks who grew up with this odd little sandwich still remember the taste. Sometimes getting by meant getting creative. The Southern loved making use of every part of the pig, and this next one was no exception. I'm talking about chitterlings or chitlins. These are the intestines of the pig. And while they might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of barbecue, they've been a beloved part of Southern barbecue culture for generations. Barbecued or smoked chitlins are prepared by thoroughly cleaning and cooking the intestines until they're tender and flavorful. The key to making chitlins enjoyable is all about seasoning and preparation, turning what might seem like an unusual ingredient into a delicious barbecue treat. Now, I'm not saying everyone will love them, but they definitely have a loyal following. But like many traditional foods, chitlins are falling out of favor. It's a sad day for those who appreciate the bold flavors of the South. Quick macaroni and stewed tomatoes was one of those meals that showed up when there was not much left in the pantry, but families still needed dinner on the table fast. You boiled some elbow macaroni, opened a can of stewed tomatoes, and stirred it all together with salt, pepper, and a little butter if you could spare it. That was it. It sounds humble, but back when budgets were tight and grocery trips were rare, this simple stovetop meal came through. The pasta filled you up, the tomatoes added flavor, and it all came together in under 10 minutes. You would find recipes like this scribbled in old cookbooks, passed down from one generation to the next, or clipped from women's magazines that promised fast, filling meals on a shoestring budget. It might seem plain now, but quick macaroni and stewed tomatoes helped plenty of families stretch their groceries and make dinner happen, even on the hardest days. Molasses milk with soda crackers. Sounds strange now, but for rural families and Depression-era kitchens, it was a fast, practical breakfast when the fridge was nearly bare. You would warm up some milk, stir in molasses for sweetness, and crumble soda crackers right on top. That was it. It was not fancy, but it filled you up, gave you a little energy, and made use of things that lasted forever in the pantry. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and packed with nutrients. Soda crackers were everywhere, and milk, fresh or canned, was always a breakfast staple. Old farm cookbooks, church recipe cards, and rural homemaker guides all had versions of this tucked inside, passed around by folks who knew how to stretch the simplest ingredients. It was humble, filling, and comforting in its own odd way. These days, it is almost unheard of, replaced by granola bars and cereal bowls. But back then, this quiet little breakfast got people through hard mornings with nothing but warm milk and a little ingenuity. Campbell's mushroom soup over toast was one of those forgotten Depression-era dinners that somehow made a quiet comeback in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 70s. It was as simple as it sounds, but it filled your belly fast. You opened a can of creamy mushroom soup, heated it up in a pot, and spooned it over slices of buttered toast. That was dinner. It did not pretend to be anything fancy, but when the cupboards were almost empty and the clock was ticking, it got the job done. Families leaned on meals like this when money was tight and time was short. It turned one can of soup into a warm, filling meal that stretched across the table. Maybe you sprinkled some black pepper on top, maybe a little dried parsley, but most folks kept it plain. It soaked into the bread, made the whole kitchen smell like home, and filled you up after a long day. Those old cookbooks were full of meals like this, simple recipes that felt comforting without much effort. Funny how the humblest dinners tend to stick around the longest, even when everything else changes. Let's take a wild turn because this one is a far cry from the classic barbecue menu. But hog maw was a true barbecue favorite in its own right. Now, hog maw, or pig stomach, is exactly what it sounds like: the stomach of a pig, stuffed with a mixture of spices, vegetables, and sometimes meat, then slow cooked or barbecued. This dish has deep roots in Southern barbecue traditions where no part of the pig goes to waste. Now, I'm not going to lie, it sounds challenging. But for those brave souls who dared to try it, it was apparently a culinary adventure. You know what they say, to each their own, so if you're a fan of this meal, I'm not judging. Mayo and lettuce sandwiches were one of those simple, no-nonsense Depression-era meals that somehow filled you up when there was not much else to work with. You slapped some mayonnaise on soft sandwich bread, added a few crisp iceberg lettuce leaves, and called it lunch. That was it. It might sound plain today, but back when grocery shelves were bare and paychecks were stretched thin, this quick little meal showed up on a lot of kitchen tables. Families made do with what they had, and mayonnaise gave the sandwich some fat and flavor while lettuce added crunch and made it feel fresh. It was cheap, fast, and surprisingly satisfying when times were tough. You would see it scribbled onto old recipe cards or passed down through word of mouth as a quick lunch fix that cost next to nothing. These sandwiches are mostly forgotten now, but back then, they were a lifesaver that came together in under 10 minutes. Cold rice with milk and sugar was the ultimate make-do breakfast pulled from the back pages of old community cookbooks and family kitchen tables when leftovers were all that stood between you and an empty stomach. You would take leftover rice, pour cold milk over it, sprinkle a little sugar or cinnamon if you had it, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. It sounds plain now, but back then, it was practical, frugal, and good enough to keep you going. Farmers, Factory workers and school kids all started the day with simple meals like this when groceries ran low, but mornings never slowed down. Cold rice was easy to stretch, milk made it creamy, and sugar turned it into something that actually felt like breakfast. Some families tossed in raisins or fruit if they had extra, but most kept it plain and quick. You will not find this breakfast on menus today, but back then it quietly kept families fed with nothing but leftovers and a little kitchen ingenuity. Funny how the simplest meals fade away. American chop suey with elbows and tomato sauce was how families made a one-pan dinner stretch across the whole table without breaking the bank. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet, elbow macaroni tossed right in, and a jar of tomato sauce poured over the top. Everything simmered together until the pasta was tender, the beef was cooked through, and the sauce thickened up. It took less than 10 minutes to pull together, and nobody left the table hungry. This meal came straight from the old cookbooks tucked away in kitchen drawers, the ones full of budget tricks and fast dinners for busy families. American chop suey was not fancy, but it was dependable, hot, and filling. The elbows caught just enough sauce, the beef added protein, and the whole thing fed a crowd without much effort. Families leaned on meals like this because they worked. They were fast, affordable, and made sure dinner still happened even when paychecks ran short. You could dress it up with a little cheese or keep it plain, but either way, it hit the spot. Funny how the simplest meals stick around the longest. Finally, let's wrap things up with barbecue goat ribs, a dish that's less common today but still holds a special place in the world of barbecue. While pork ribs often steal the spotlight, goat ribs offer a unique and flavorful alternative, and word on the street says they're even better. In many cultures, goat meat is prized for its leanness and robust flavor. The ribs, in particular, offer a tender and juicy eating experience when slow cooked over low heat. Whether grilled, smoked, or barbecued, goat ribs benefit from marinades or rubs that complement their inherent taste. So a common misconception about goat meat is its toughness. However, when cooked properly, goat ribs can be incredibly tender and flavorful. The key is to cook them slowly over low heat, allowing the meat to break down and absorb the flavors of the smoke or grill. Interestingly, goat meat and, by extension, goat ribs have a rich history in the American South, particularly in states like Texas, Louisiana, and the Carolinas. Grape jelly meatball skillet might sound like a strange mix now, but back then, it was one of those quirky, sweet, and savory meals that showed up fast and stretched what little meat you had. You browned some mini meatballs in a skillet, poured in grape jelly and a splash of mustard, and let it all bubble together. In 10 minutes flat, dinner was ready. It was sweet, tangy, salty, and surprisingly filling. Families leaned on recipes like this because they turned a small amount of ground beef into a meal that felt bigger than it was. You could find this in old church cookbooks, clipped from women's magazines, or scribbled onto recipe cards tucked in drawers. It was not about fancy ingredients. It was about getting something warm, satisfying, and a little fun onto the table, fast. Today it feels forgotten, but back then, this sweet skillet meal kept homes running during the toughest weeks. Canned peach halves with cottage cheese was the quiet, no-cook breakfast that kept dieters, seniors, and busy families fed when time and groceries were both running low. You would grab a can of peach halves, spoon some cottage cheese in the center, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. Sweet, creamy, and filling enough to count, it showed up in weight loss guides, homemaker magazines, and community cookbooks promising simple, affordable meals. Parents loved it because it was fast and required no stove, and older folks leaned on it when cooking felt like too much work. It might sound odd now, but back then, canned fruit and cottage cheese were pantry staples that stretched far and kept mornings moving. Some versions added a drizzle of honey or chopped nuts, but most kept it plain, quick, and practical. It is one of those breakfasts that slipped away as frozen meals and grab-and-go options took over, but back then, it was quietly keeping families fed with nothing but a can opener and a spoon. Hot dog and Velveeta quesadillas were a dinner shortcut that showed up when there was no time and even less energy to cook. You sliced hot dogs, laid them into a tortilla with chunks of Velveeta cheese, folded it over, and tossed the whole thing in a hot skillet until the cheese melted and the tortilla crisped. That was dinner. It took less than 10 minutes, filled you up, and made the best of whatever was left in the fridge. Old cookbooks and family recipe boxes leaned on meals like this because they were fast, cheap, and comforting. The salty hot dogs, gooey cheese, and crispy tortilla made this simple dinner feel like more than the sum of its parts. You could dip it in ketchup, mustard, or just eat it plain, but either way, it was satisfying. Families on tight budgets and tight schedules loved meals like this. They stretched groceries, came together fast, and kept everyone full. Funny how a tortilla, some cheese, and a hot dog could feel like enough when the pantry looked bare. Share your favorite forgotten barbecue, hit like and subscribe so these smoky old recipes stay alive.